Michael Grayson was a man who had worked hard to carve out his little corner of the world. His workshop, a spacious property on the outskirts of town, was his sanctuary, a place where he could focus on his craft and rent out spaces to local entrepreneurs who shared his passion for building, creating, and innovating. For years, the lot had been a source of pride and stability for Michael, a rare gem he had chosen specifically because of its isolation from the chaos of residential neighborhoods. No overzealous committees or regulations dictated how he could use his space. It was his, and his alone. One brisk morning, Michael pulled into his lot and immediately noticed something was off. Rows of trucks were parked haphazardly across the property, blocking access to the main workshop entrance. A few of the vehicles had tarps loosely thrown over their beds, while others had crates stacked high, as if someone had decided to turn his meticulously organized property into a makeshift storage yard. His stomach churned as he drove slowly past the vehicles, taking in the mess. Trash littered the ground, discarded coffee cups, wrappers, and even what looked like remnants of construction debris. It wasn't just an eyesore, it was a direct violation of the space he had worked so hard to maintain. Michael parked his truck near the office building at the edge of the property, his mind already racing with questions. Who would dare use his land without permission, and how had they gotten in? The gates to the lot were usually locked after hours, and only a select few tenants had keys or access codes. As he approached the main entrance, a gust of wind carried a piece of paper across the lot. He reached down and picked it up, only to realize it wasn't just random litter. It was a notice, a cheap, mass-printed flyer with bold text at the top: "Notice temporary community. Use." The rest of the text claimed the lot was now designated for overflow parking and storage, to support nearby construction projects and community needs. Michael's confusion quickly turned to anger. Who had authorized this? He owned the property outright. There was no legal agreement, no clause in any city ordinance that could justify someone commandeering his land without his consent. He marched to his office, crumpling the flyer in his hand as he unlocked the door and stepped inside. Once at his desk, Michael began making calls. He reached out to his tenants first, but none of them knew anything about the trucks or the notice. Some of them had even been blocked from accessing their rented spaces that morning, adding to the chaos. One tenant, a furniture maker named Tom, mentioned that he'd seen the trucks arriving late the previous night but hadn't thought much of it. "I assumed it was one of your new projects," Tom admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "But I didn't think they'd just take over like that." Michael's next call was to the city zoning office, but after being transferred between departments and waiting on hold for nearly an hour, he received a vague and unhelpful response. The clerk told him there were no permits on file for the use of his property and advised him to check with the neighborhood association, even though Michael's lot wasn't part of any residential district. Frustrated but determined, he called the number listed on the flyer, which led to an answering service with a generic voicemail about community improvement initiatives. He left a message demanding a callback and hung up, his jaw tight with frustration. Stepping outside to survey the scene again, Michael noticed fresh tire marks leading onto the lot from a side gate he rarely used. The lock on that gate had been cut clean through, the metal edges jagged and twisted. Whoever had done this hadn't just overstepped, they'd committed an outright act of trespassing. It was a brazen violation that made his blood boil. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a neighborly request gone too far. This was theft of his space, his peace of mind, and potentially his livelihood. Michael's thoughts turned to action. He called a towing company and explained the situation, but the dispatcher hesitated. "Are you sure they're not there with some kind of permit?" the man asked. "We can't tow unless it's clear they're trespassing." Michael assured him there were no permits, no agreements, and no legitimate reason for the trucks to be on his lot. The dispatcher reluctantly agreed to send a team out, but it would take a few hours. In the meantime, Michael began documenting the scene, taking photos of the trucks, the cut lock, and the flyer he'd found. As the morning wore on, Michael's frustration deepened. A few of the truck drivers returned to the lot, each of them acting as though they had every right to be there. When Michael confronted one of them, a burly man in a reflective vest, the driver simply shrugged. "I was told this was the spot," he said, before climbing into his cab and pulling out his phone, clearly uninterested in further discussion. Another driver muttered something about community arrangements before walking away. By the time the tow trucks arrived, Michael had had enough. He directed them to remove the vehicles, watching with grim satisfaction as one by one, the trucks were hauled away. Some of the drivers protested, but Michael stood his ground, armed with his documentation and his unwavering conviction that this was his property, and no one had the right to invade it. As the last truck disappeared down the road, Michael allowed himself a moment of relief. But that relief was short-lived. Later that afternoon, he received a call from an unfamiliar number. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Margaret Lowell, a representative of the so-called community group that had left the flyer. Her tone was polite but firm, laced with an undercurrent of condescension. "Mr. Grayson," she began, "we're disappointed to hear about the removal of the trucks. They were placed there as part of an agreement with the Neighborhood Development Council." Michael cut her off, his voice sharp. "There's no agreement. This is private property. If you or anyone else comes back without my permission, you'll be dealing with the police." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Margaret responded, her tone now icy. "I'd advise you to reconsider your position. Actions like these can have consequences." As the call ended, Michael felt a chill run through him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whoever these people were, they weren't going to back down easily. But neither was he. This was his land, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it from him. The following morning, Michael Grayson arrived at his workshop earlier than usual, still reeling from the audacity of the trucks and the smug call from Margaret Lowell. His first priority was to ensure that the lot remained secured, and he had already contacted a locksmith to replace the cut lock on the side gate. When he parked his truck near the entrance, he noticed fresh tracks in the dirt leading onto his property. His chest tightened. Someone had been back. Michael scanned the lot and saw no immediate sign of intruders, but the evidence was clear. The tracks veered toward the rear of the workshop, where he stored heavy machinery and rented out additional storage spaces. He followed the tracks on foot, the early morning air heavy with tension. When he turned the corner, he stopped in his tracks. There, at the back of the property, was a group of men unloading more equipment from several vans and trucks. The vehicles were parked as if this was a coordinated effort, and the men worked quickly, barely acknowledging his presence. "Hey," Michael shouted, striding toward them, "what the hell are you doing on my property?" One of the men, wearing a clipboard slung around his neck, glanced at Michael with an air of irritation. "We're setting up," he said casually, as if that explained everything. Setting up for what? Michael demanded, his voice rising. "This is private property, and you have no right to be here. Pack up your things and get out." The man sighed, lowering the clipboard. "Look, I don't know all the details. We were contracted to set up temporary infrastructure for community use. If you've got a problem, take it up with the people who hired us." He turned his back and gestured for the others to keep working. Michael's hands clenched into fists. He wasn't about to stand idly by while strangers took over his land. "I'm not asking again. You're trespassing," he said through gritted teeth, "and if you're not gone in the next 5 minutes, I'll have the cops here to remove you." The man glanced back at him, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Fine. Let me make a call," he muttered, pulling out his phone. As he stepped aside to speak in hushed tones, the other workers exchanged wary looks but continued unloading equipment. Michael walked back to his truck, his pulse pounding as he dialed the non-emergency line for the local police. After explaining the situation, the dispatcher assured him that an officer would be sent to the scene. While he waited, Michael kept his eyes on the workers, who showed no sign of slowing down, despite his warnings. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were operating with a sense of impunity, as if they believed they were untouchable. 15 minutes later, a patrol car pulled into the lot. The officer, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped out and approached Michael. After listening to his explanation, the officer turned his attention to the workers, who had finally paused their activities. The man with the clipboard approached the officer, waving a sheet of paper. "This is the authorization we were given," the man said confidently. "We're just doing our job." Michael watched as the officer examined the document, his brow furrowing. This looks like it came from some kind of local council or association, the officer said, glancing back at Michael. Do you know anything about this? Michael shook his head. I've already checked with zoning. There's no permit, no authorization for anything like this. This is my property, and I didn't agree to any of it. The officer nodded, handing the paper back to the man. Without clear proof of authorization from the property owner, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The man with the clipboard hesitated, clearly unhappy with the turn of events, but he eventually motioned for the workers to start packing up. They loaded the equipment back into their trucks, though they moved with a deliberate slowness that seemed almost spiteful. As the last truck pulled out of the lot, the officer turned to Michael. I'd recommend getting a copy of this document and following up with legal counsel. Something about this doesn't sit right with me. Michael thanked the officer and took a photo of the document before the workers left. It was a poorly formatted letter, supposedly issued by a neighborhood development council, full of vague language about community resource initiatives and temporary land use designations. Nothing about it seemed official, and Michael suspected it was a fabrication meant to intimidate him. Back in his office, Michael sent the photo to his lawyer, who promised to review it immediately. In the meantime, Michael decided to take additional precautions. He contacted a local security company and arranged for a team to install cameras and motion sensors around the perimeter of the property. If anyone tried to return, he wanted proof of their actions. Later that afternoon, Michael received a call from his lawyer. Michael, that document is completely bogus, she said, her voice firm. It has no legal standing whatsoever. This so-called development council isn't a recognized entity. It's either a front for something else or a group of individuals acting outside the law. Michael felt a surge of vindication but also a gnawing sense of unease. If the document was fake, what else were these people willing to fabricate? His lawyer continued, I've filed a preliminary complaint with the county, but I'd recommend being extra cautious. These people might not back down easily, and we need to be ready for any escalation. As the sun set, Michael walked the perimeter of his lot, checking the new locks and inspecting the freshly installed cameras. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though the lot was empty and silent. His instincts told him that this wasn't over. Whoever was behind this had invested time and resources into targeting his property, and they weren't going to walk away just because a police officer told them to leave. That night, as Michael locked up the office and prepared to head home, he noticed something unusual on the side gate where the previous lock had been cut. A small, shiny object was wedged into the hinge. Frowning, he stepped closer and carefully pulled it out. It was a USB drive, wrapped in a piece of paper that read "Reconsider." Michael stared at the note, his mind racing. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was something far more calculated, and it was clear that the people he was dealing with were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to pressure him into compliance. For the first time, Michael felt a chill of fear. As he drove home, the USB drive sat on the passenger seat, a stark reminder that the battle for his property had only just begun. He had no intention of giving in, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was up against something far bigger than he'd initially imagined. The next day, Michael arrived at his lot feeling a mix of determination and unease. The events of the past 2 days had left him rattled, but he wasn't about to back down. His first priority was to figure out what exactly he was dealing with. The USB drive he'd found the previous evening still sat in his truck's center console, untouched. Michael had debated plugging it in the night before, but decided against it, worried it might contain malware or something worse. He resolved to take it to a professional IT specialist later that day. As he pulled into his property, Michael immediately noticed something was off again. A large delivery truck was parked near the main entrance, its back doors wide open, and workers were unloading crates and stacking them haphazardly near the workshop. His anger flared, but he forced himself to remain calm. Confronting them without understanding their purpose might give them an opening to escalate things further. Michael stepped out of his truck and approached the workers. This time he counted 6 of them, all wearing generic uniforms with no company logos. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice firm but measured. One of the workers, a younger man with a clipboard, looked up at him with feigned surprise. "Oh, you must be the owner. We're just making a drop-off." "Nothing to worry about," he said casually, as if his presence was the most normal thing in the world. Michael narrowed his eyes. "A drop-off for what?" "I didn't authorize anything, and this is private property. Whatever you're doing here, it ends now. Load that stuff back up and leave." The man with the clipboard hesitated, then held up a sheet of paper with a practiced air of authority. "We've got instructions from the council to deliver this equipment here. If there's been a mix-up, you'll need to take it up with them." Michael snatched the paper out of his hand and scanned it. It looked similar to the fake document he'd photographed the day before, poorly formatted, vague and riddled with jargon about community initiatives. His grip on the paper tightened. "This is garbage," he said sharply. "Get off my land, or I'll have you all arrested for trespassing." The workers exchanged uneasy glances but didn't move. One of them muttered something under his breath, and the man with the clipboard shrugged. "Look, sir, we're just doing our job. If you've got a problem, take it up with the people in charge. We're not trying to cause trouble." Michael could feel his frustration boiling over, but he kept his tone controlled. "This is your final warning. Pack up and leave. Now." The workers hesitated for a moment longer, then began loading the crates back into the truck, grumbling as they worked. Michael stood his ground, watching them closely to ensure they didn't leave anything behind. Once the truck was gone, he exhaled slowly, his fists still clenched. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a coordinated effort to intimidate him and undermine his ownership of the property. Determined to take the next step, Michael drove into town to meet with his lawyer and show her the new document. As they reviewed it together, her expression grew grim. "This is even sloppier than the first one," she said, tapping the paper with her pen. "But the fact that they keep producing these fake authorizations tells me they're trying to build a paper trail, even if it's completely illegitimate. If this escalates further, they could use these documents to muddy the waters in court." Michael frowned. "So what do we do? I can't let them keep pulling this nonsense." His lawyer leaned back in her chair, thinking. "For now, I'll draft a formal cease and desist letter and file it with the county. That will make it clear that you're contesting their claims. But I think it's time to start gathering more concrete evidence. We need to figure out who's really behind this." Michael nodded, his mind already racing with ideas. He mentioned the USB drive, and his lawyer raised an eyebrow. "Be careful with that," she warned. "Take it to a specialist before plugging it into anything. It could be a trap." Later that afternoon, Michael dropped the USB drive off at a local firm, explaining the situation in vague terms. The technician assured him they would analyze it and contact him as soon as they found anything. With that task handled, Michael returned to his lot, determined to shore up his defenses. The security cameras he'd installed earlier in the week were already proving useful. Reviewing the footage, he saw that the delivery truck had entered the property through the side gate, where someone had once again cut the lock. The footage showed two men arriving in a pickup truck shortly before the delivery team, armed with bolt cutters and moving with practiced efficiency. They had disabled the lock in less than a minute, then disappeared before the larger truck arrived. Michael shared the footage with the security company, who agreed to reinforce the gates and install additional cameras to cover the blind spots. He also contacted the police again, filing a formal complaint about the repeated trespassing and vandalism. While the officers were sympathetic, their hands were tied without solid evidence linking the incidents to a specific organization or individual. That evening, as Michael reviewed the day's events, he received a call from the IT firm. The technician's voice was cautious. "Mr. Grayson, we've looked at the USB drive you brought in. It's unusual. There are encrypted files on it that we haven't been able to crack yet, but the unencrypted files contain blueprints and schematics for some kind of infrastructure project. It's labeled as a community redevelopment plan. But the scale and detail suggest something much larger. I'd recommend bringing this to your lawyer." Michael thanked the technician and hung up, his mind racing. Blueprints? Redevelopment plans? What did any of this have to do with his lot? He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The next morning he received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in bold letters, "You making this harder than it needs to be." Michael stared at the note, his jaw tightening. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to intimidate him, they were escalating their tactics, pushing him to either give in or make a mistake. But Michael wasn't about to roll over. He'd worked too hard to build his business and protect his property, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. He spent the rest of the day preparing for the next move. His lawyer filed the cease and desist letter. The gates were reinforced with heavy-duty locks, and the security company installed motion-activated floodlights around the perimeter. Michael also reached out to his tenants, explaining the situation and reassuring them that he was taking steps to resolve it. Despite his best efforts, Michael couldn't shake the sense of unease that hung over him. He knew this was far from over, and the stakes were only getting higher. But if his adversaries thought they could break him, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The days following the latest round of intrusions were marked by an uneasy calm on Michael's lot. The reinforced gates, floodlights, and new security measures seemed to keep trespassers at bay for now. Michael knew better than to assume the situation was resolved, though. Every move by his adversaries had been calculated, designed to intimidate and wear him down, and he had no doubt they were preparing for the next step. He spent much of his time working with his lawyer, gathering evidence, and preparing for any legal battle that might come. The USB drive, with its encrypted files and suspicious blueprints, loomed large in his mind. His lawyer had sent the drive to a forensic specialist, someone with the skills and tools to crack the encryption. Whatever secrets the files held, Michael suspected they would shed light on why his property had become a target. It was on one of these quieter afternoons, as Michael was reviewing camera footage from the lot, that something unusual caught his attention. A nondescript van had parked across the street from his property, just outside the view of his main cameras. The van lingered for hours, its occupants unseen, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to the ongoing situation. Later that evening, when the van finally left, he walked out to the road to inspect the area. In the dirt near where the van had been parked, he found the faint outline of footprints leading toward the lot's perimeter. Michael followed the tracks cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. They led him to the far side of the property, near the southern fence line, a less frequently used part of the lot. There he found something unexpected, a small electronic device mounted to the fence, tucked behind a bush. It was sleek and unfamiliar, with a blinking light and a small antenna protruding from the top. He didn't touch it, unsure of its purpose, but he photographed it from every angle before calling the security company. When the security team arrived, they identified the device as a signal jammer, likely intended to interfere with the cameras or other electronics on the property. Michael's frustration grew. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trespassing, they were actively trying to sabotage his defenses. The security team removed the jammer and assured him they'd sweep the rest of the lot for any other devices. The next morning, Michael's lawyer called with news about the USB drive. "We've managed to decrypt a portion of the files," she said. "It's troubling, to say the least." She explained that the files contained detailed plans for a large-scale development project, one that included Michael's lot as a central component. According to the documents, his property was slated to become the site of a major distribution hub, with surrounding areas earmarked for retail and residential expansion. The plans were highly specific, down to the square footage of proposed buildings and the routes for delivery trucks. Michael's blood ran cold. "And they didn't think to ask me if I'd sell," he said bitterly. His lawyer sighed. "That's the thing. There's no record of them attempting to purchase the property. It looks like they're operating under the assumption that you'll either sell under pressure or be forced out." Michael's grip on the phone tightened. "That's not going to happen." Her tone grew more serious. "Michael, there's something else. Some of the files reference backdoor agreements with local officials, permits being fast-tracked, zoning changes being pre-approved. It's clear they've been planning this for a while. You might be dealing with more than just a rogue developer. There's a network of people involved, and they're betting on you not having the resources to fight back." Michael thanked her and hung up, his mind racing. The pieces were starting to come together. This wasn't a simple property dispute. His lot was a crucial part of a much larger operation, one that likely involved significant money and influence. The attempts to intimidate him, the fake documents, the sabotage, they were all designed to force him out without attracting too much attention. Determined to disrupt their plans, Michael decided to take a more proactive approach. He reached out to his tenants, explaining the situation in detail and asking for their cooperation. Most of them were supportive, though some expressed concern about the potential fallout. One tenant, a contractor named Jerry, offered to help reinforce the lot's security. "I've dealt with these kinds of people before," Jerry said. "They'll keep pushing until they think it's not worth the effort. We just need to make it as difficult as possible for them." Jerry's advice proved prescient. That night, Michael's cameras captured another attempt to breach the lot. 3 figures in dark clothing were caught on video trying to cut through the new locks on the side gate. When they triggered the motion-activated floodlights, they scattered, leaving behind a set of bolt cutters and a crowbar. Michael handed the footage over to the police, but once again there was little they could do without identifying the suspects. The next escalation came in the form of a formal notice delivered to Michael's office. The document, bearing the letterhead of a newly created development company, accused him of obstructing progress on a critical community project and demanded he vacate the property within 30 days. Enclosed with the notice was an offer to purchase the lot, at a price far below its market value. Michael's lawyer quickly identified the notice as another bluff, lacking any legal weight, but it signaled that his adversaries were growing bolder. A few days later, Michael received a call from Jerry. "You're not going to believe this," Jerry said. "There's a protest forming outside the lot." Michael drove to the property immediately and found a small crowd gathered near the entrance, holding signs with slogans like "Support Progress" and "Stop the Greed." It was a calculated move, clearly orchestrated to paint Michael as an obstacle to community development. The protesters were loud but orderly, staying just outside the property line. Michael called the police, but they informed him that as long as the protesters didn't trespass or block access, there was little they could do. Frustrated but undeterred, Michael spent the rest of the day documenting the scene and coordinating with his lawyer. The protest was another tactic to pressure him into compliance, but it only strengthened his resolve. That evening, he held a meeting with his tenants, outlining a plan to maintain operations despite the disruptions. He also decided to hire additional security personnel to ensure the safety of the property and its occupants. As the week went on, the tension continued to build. More protesters arrived, and the development company ramped up its efforts, sending additional notices and thinly veiled threats. But Michael refused to back down. He knew that giving in now would only embolden his adversaries, and he was determined to protect what was rightfully his. One night, as Michael was reviewing his notes in the office, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm but menacing. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Mr. Grayson, the caller, said. "You have a chance to walk away with something, but if you keep fighting, you'll lose everything. Think about it." Michael's response was immediate. "You can keep trying to scare me, but it's not going to work. I'm not going anywhere." The line went dead, but the words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the stakes. Michael knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let them win. The escalation began early the next morning, with an unwelcome surprise waiting for Michael Grayson as he arrived at his lot. A large sign had been erected overnight near the main entrance, emblazoned with bold red letters: "Development Site, no trespassing, property under review." The sign was professional, complete with the logo of the so-called development company that had been harassing him. It stood tall and imposing, as if daring Michael to challenge its authority. Michael's stomach churned as he examined the sign. It was another calculated move, designed to confuse his tenants and create the illusion that his property was no longer his to control. He wasted no time calling his lawyer, snapping pictures of the sign and sending them over for documentation. "This is another bluff," his lawyer assured him over the phone. "They're trying to create the appearance of legitimacy, but it holds no legal weight. I'll add this to our complaint." Michael nodded to himself, her words providing a momentary sense of relief. But as he stepped back to take in the scene, his sense of unease grew. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was psychological warfare. As he entered the lot, Michael noticed another troubling development. Several of his tenants had gathered near the workshop, talking in hushed tones. The tension in the air was palpable. One of them, Jerry, approached him, his expression grim. "You might want to see this," Jerry said, leading Michael toward the rear of the property. When they arrived, Michael's jaw tightened. A section of the fence had been cut open, leaving a gaping hole that led to a path of fresh tire tracks in the dirt. The tracks stretched deep into the lot, past the storage units and toward the back warehouse. As they followed the trail, they found discarded crates and equipment scattered along the way, as if someone had been in too much of a hurry to clean up. Inside the warehouse, the damage was even worse. Shelves had been knocked over, supplies strewn across the floor, and several items appeared to be missing. It was clear that someone had used the cover of night to break in and ransack the place. Michael's frustration boiled over as he surveyed the damage. "That's it," he said through gritted teeth. "I'm not waiting for them to make the next move. This ends now." He spent the next few hours documenting everything, taking photos and video of the damage, the tire tracks, and the cut fence. He filed another police report, but the officers who arrived seemed just as limited in their ability to act as before. "We'll investigate," one of them said, his tone non-committal. "But without witnesses or more concrete evidence, it's tough to pin this on anyone." Michael couldn't help but feel like he was fighting this battle alone. But giving up wasn't an option. He called a local contractor to repair the fence and began drafting a notice to his tenants, reassuring them that he was taking every possible step to secure the property. Later that afternoon, Michael's lawyer called with another update. The development company had filed a formal complaint against him with the local planning board, accusing him of obstructing progress on a designated improvement project. The complaint demanded that he cease operations on his lot until the matter could be resolved. "It's complete nonsense," his lawyer said. "They're trying to bog you down in bureaucratic red tape, hoping to exhaust your resources and patience. But don't worry, we're filing a counter-complaint to expose their lack of standing." Michael appreciated her confidence, but the mounting pressure was undeniable. Every move the development company made seemed designed to undermine him from multiple angles. If it wasn't physical sabotage, it was legal harassment. That evening, Michael called a meeting with his tenants. He laid out the situation as clearly as possible, emphasizing that he was doing everything in his power to protect their interests. Most of them were supportive, though a few expressed concern about how long the conflict might drag on. "What happens if they come back?" one tenant asked. Michael met the question head-on. "We're not going to let them push us out," he said firmly. "This is our space, and we're going to fight for it." The next escalation came just 2 days later, in the form of another protest outside the lot. This time, the crowd was larger, with over a dozen people holding signs and chanting slogans. The protesters had clearly been coached, their messages carefully crafted to paint Michael as a greedy landowner standing in the way of community progress. The chants were loud enough to disrupt operations on the lot, and several tenants called Michael to voice their frustrations. Determined not to let the protesters gain the upper hand, Michael contacted the police again. But just as before, the response was lukewarm. The protesters weren't breaking any laws, and as long as they stayed off the property, there was little the police could do. Realizing he needed to take matters into his own hands, Michael decided to document the protest thoroughly. He hired a professional photographer to capture images of the signs, the protesters, and their activities. He also instructed his security team to monitor the situation closely, ensuring that no one crossed onto the lot or interfered with operations. That night, as Michael reviewed the footage and photos, he noticed something strange. Several of the protesters appeared to be the same people he'd seen working for the development company. They weren't community members at all, they were hired actors, paid to create the illusion of grassroots support for the project. Michael's lawyer confirmed his suspicions the next day. "It's a classic tactic," she said. "Astroturfing. They're trying to make it look like there's public demand for this project when, in reality, it's all staged. We can use this against them." With this new evidence in hand, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. He filed an additional complaint with the planning board, citing the staged protests as evidence of bad faith tactics by the development company. He also reached out to local business associations, rallying support from other property owners who had faced similar challenges. But the development company wasn't done yet. That weekend, Michael discovered yet another attempt to sabotage his property. Several of his security cameras had been tampered with, their lenses sprayed with black paint. The motion-activated floodlights near the rear of the lot had also been disabled, leaving the area vulnerable to further intrusion. Furious but undeterred, Michael immediately ordered replacements for the damaged equipment and instructed his security team to conduct round-the-clock patrols. He also began exploring options for hiring private investigators to dig deeper into the development company's operations. The following day, Michael received another call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was cold and deliberate. "You're wasting your time, Mr. Grayson," the caller said. "This project is happening, with or without your cooperation. The sooner you accept that, the easier it'll be for everyone." Michael's response was calm but resolute. "You can keep trying to intimidate me, but it's not going to work. This is my property and I'm not going anywhere." The caller chuckled darkly. "We'll see about that," he said before hanging up. As Michael set the phone down, his resolve hardened. He knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let them win. Not now. Not ever. The breaking point came on a chilly Thursday evening. Michael Grayson was in his office, meticulously reviewing the latest legal documents his lawyer had prepared, when the power suddenly went out. The hum of the workshop's machinery died instantly, replaced by an unsettling silence. He stood up, peering out the window. The floodlights that usually bathed the lot in a protective glow were dark, leaving the property shrouded in shadow. Michael grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, his breath visible in the cold air. The lot seemed deserted, but his instincts told him otherwise. He walked toward the power box near the back fence, his boots crunching on the gravel. As he approached, the beam of his flashlight revealed the damage. The lock on the power box had been cut, and the switch had been forcibly flipped. Someone had deliberately sabotaged the system. Before Michael could assess the full extent of the damage, a loud metallic clang echoed from the other side of the lot. He turned sharply, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the beam revealed nothing. His pulse quickened as he scanned the area. It was clear whoever had done this was still nearby. He doubled back to his office, locking the door behind him and activating the emergency backup power for the cameras. The monitors flickered to life, displaying grainy black and white footage of the lot. That's when he saw them, 3 figures in dark clothing, moving with purpose toward the storage units. One of them carried what appeared to be a crowbar, while another hauled a bulky bag over his shoulder. Michael's jaw tightened as he grabbed his phone to call the police. As the dispatcher assured him that officers were on their way, Michael's eyes remained fixed on the monitors. The intruders had begun prying open one of the storage unit doors, their movements precise and practiced. By the time the police arrived, the intruders were gone, leaving behind a ransacked storage unit and a trail of discarded tools. The officers surveyed the scene, noting the damage and collecting what little evidence they could. One officer, a younger man with a sympathetic expression, approached Michael. "It looks like they were after something specific," the officer said. "Do you know what was in that unit?" Michael shook his head. "It's rented out to one of my tenants. I'll need to check with them to figure out what might have been taken." The officer nodded, but his tone was cautious. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Grayson. This feels like part of a larger operation. These guys knew what they were doing." Michael thanked the officers and promised to follow up with any additional information. As they left, he couldn't shake the officers' words. Whoever these people were, they weren't just petty vandals. This was organized, deliberate, and far too professional to be random. The next morning, Michael received a call from his tenant, confirming his fears. The stolen items included valuable construction equipment and sensitive documents related to ongoing projects. It was a targeted theft, meant to disrupt operations and send a message. Determined to fight back, Michael reached out to his lawyer and shared the latest developments. She advised him to move forward with an emergency injunction, barring the development company and their associates from any further actions on his property. Meanwhile, Michael decided to take matters into his own hands. He hired a private investigator to dig deeper into the development company, determined to uncover who was behind the relentless campaign against him. A week later, the investigator delivered a bombshell report. The development company was a shell organization created solely to push through the project targeting Michael's lot. Behind it was a web of interconnected businesses and influential figures, including local officials who stood to profit from the redevelopment. The report also revealed direct ties between the company and the hired protesters, proving that the entire campaign was a sham. Armed with this evidence, Michael and his lawyer prepared for court. The hearing was tense, with the development company's representatives attempting to discredit Michael and paint him as an obstacle to progress. But when Michael's lawyer presented the investigators' findings, the courtroom fell silent. The judge, visibly displeased, demanded an explanation from the company's legal team. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that the development company's actions were not only unethical but also illegal. The judge granted the injunction, halting all activities on Michael's property and ordering an investigation into the company's practices. But the victory came with a twist. That evening, Michael received an unmarked envelope slipped under his office door. Inside was a single note, typed in bold letters, "This isn't over." Michael's first instinct was anger, but he quickly replaced it with resolve. He wasn't naive enough to believe his adversaries would simply disappear, but he also knew he had the upper hand. The court ruling had exposed their tactics and put them on notice. If they wanted to continue their campaign, they would have to do it under far more scrutiny than before. As he locked up the office for the night, Michael felt a rare sense of satisfaction. The battle wasn't over, but he had proven that he wouldn't be intimidated or pushed aside. This was his property, his livelihood, and he would fight for it with everything he had. In the weeks following the court ruling, Michael Grayson took decisive steps to secure his property and his business. The injunction had not only halted the development company's activities but also sent a clear message to anyone considering further interference. Michael was not someone who could be easily bullied or manipulated. However, he knew the fight wasn't truly over. His adversaries were wounded, but they weren't gone, and their final message, "This isn't over," hung in his mind like a dark cloud. Michael wasted no time reinforcing his defenses. He upgraded the perimeter security system with high-resolution cameras, motion-activated lights, and tamper-proof locks. A private security firm now patrolled the lot at irregular intervals, making it nearly impossible for anyone to breach the property unnoticed. The damage caused by the previous break-ins was repaired swiftly, and Michael worked closely with his tenants to restore their confidence. His transparency and determination had earned him their trust, and most of them stayed, reassured by his proactive approach. The local community, too, began to take notice of Michael's victory. Word of his legal battle spread, and other property owners who had faced similar harassment reached out to share their own stories. Many of them had given up without a fight, overwhelmed by the same tactics of intimidation and bureaucracy that Michael had resisted. Inspired by his determination, they started organizing, forming a coalition to push back against corrupt practices in the area. Michael, though reluctant to take on a leadership role, became an unofficial figurehead for the group. One of the first victories of the coalition came when they successfully petitioned the city to launch a formal investigation into the development company and its ties to local officials. As more evidence of corruption and fraud came to light, several permits and projects connected to the company were revoked. Key players in the scheme, including 2 prominent city council members, were forced to resign under the weight of public scrutiny. For Michael, these victories were gratifying, but they didn't erase the toll the conflict had taken on him. He had spent months living under constant stress, battling forces far more powerful than he had anticipated. There were moments when he had questioned whether it was worth it, whether he should have just sold the lot and walked away. But now, standing on the secure grounds of his property, watching the familiar bustle of his tenants at work, he knew he had made the right choice. The final loose end came in the form of a letter delivered to Michael's office. It was from Margaret Lowell, the woman who had been the face of the development company's campaign against him. Her tone was surprisingly conciliatory, offering an apology for the misunderstandings, and claiming she had been acting under orders she no longer believed in. She assured Michael that she had left the company and had no further interest in his property. Michael read the letter twice, skeptical of her sincerity but willing to accept the closure it provided. He filed it away with the rest of the documentation from the battle, a reminder of everything he had endured and overcome. That evening, Michael hosted a barbecue for his tenants and the members of the coalition. It was a celebration of resilience and community, a chance to reflect on the challenges they had faced together. As the sun set over the lot, casting warm light over the tables filled with food and laughter, Michael allowed himself to relax for the first time in months. His fight had been about more than just a piece of land. It was a stand against exploitation, a reminder that even when the odds seemed insurmountable, perseverance and integrity could prevail, and though he knew challenges would come again, Michael was ready. This was his lot, his business, his life, and no one was going to take it from him.